My name is Melanie Gleason. I am a pro bono immigration attorney, and I am a community lawyer who's been traveling across the U.S. for the last 4 years, and I live here in the South Bronx, where I am focusing on community lawyering here. And you can check out my webpage at attorneyonthemove.com, and I'm also on Instagram at attorneyonthemove, as well as Facebook. You are watching Bronx Vignettes. So my connection to the Bronx, I am a pro bono immigration lawyer, and I'm based in the South Bronx, and I do pro bono work here in the borough. There are a lot of things I love about the Bronx. The first thing I love is the people. I think that there are I've had so many daily interactions in the street where I'm basically coming across different types of people, and the authenticity, the realness of all the different interactions, all the different people I've met here in the borough is something that I really value. And then the food is also something that I really like as well. Yeah, a lot of really awesome community-run businesses, whether they're restaurants or they are run by local entrepreneurs, creatives in the borough. But yeah, it's just a great place to be. It reminds me a lot of where I grew up as well. So I really like the Bronx. I really like Seis Vecinos. That place is very good. And I also really like La Morada, which is also a great place. I think when I first came down here, it was just like a visceral thing for me, where I think within that first day, when I was just walking around, it felt so familiar, and I knew I was going to be here for a while. The first time I came to the Bronx was in the summer of 2016, so it was before Trump got elected. And it was, it was an interesting time in the country, because for the project that I've been doing, I've been traveling all over the country, and to be in New York City and in the borough of the Bronx the summer before the election was, it was very good to be here. So I was connected with the Grail through a friend of mine, actually, who had spent some time in the Bronx, and she doesn't live here anymore. And she knew of, basically, it's a house of a bunch of Catholic sisters, a bunch of Catholic nuns. So it wasn't my first experience living with a bunch of Catholic nuns. This project has had me living in a lot of really interesting, different situations that I wasn't previously exposed to at all. So when I had, gone ahead and started living there at the Grail, it was 2 sisters, and then I had 2 other housemates who were lay people, and then the 5 of us lived for that late summer in that building. And because of the Catholic sisters' connections to the community, they basically helped plug me into different places where I was able to run these pro bono clinics, one of which was St. Mark's, which is on 138th, and I just drove by the other day. I know that's still there. I think there was some question about whether or not that was going to stay open or not. And then the other was at the Mercy Center, also in the South Bronx. So it was really, as soon as I got here, as I was talking about before, just the notion of community in the Bronx, where people were really eager to help me plug into different places. And yeah, I would say that first week, I pretty much hopped on a bus here, and then I had moved in with the Catholic sisters, and I was running that clinic by the end of the first week. So they were really instrumental in helping me get started with that. And I think about how every single person on this earth really doesn't have any control over where they're born. They are born somewhere, they have no control over that fact, if you will. I think it's really about the community that person is in. I think it's about that person in themselves and how they themselves are building up and working with that community. I've always lived off the 6 train, so I feel like I have a loyalty to the 6. And the best is when the 6 Express is running, which is kind of during these little windows that aren't always consistent, so it feels like an extra, like I just scored something in like a big way. And then I think the least favorite, and it's all good, but when it's local, I feel there's just that, it could have been the Express. It could have been the Express. Yeah. When I think of American immigration in this country, I think that, and you're dealing with the law too, and I think the law in and of itself, it has all this precedent. It tends to be stoked in, with the status quo. So you have all these various issues. So I think essentially whatever types of creative ways whether it's an organization or a solo practitioner, with or without, ideally with a lot of collaboration, can go ahead and address those issues head on. I think that's where you're going to see more systemic change and more individual change as well. So there's a lot of great organizations in New York City, a lot. I've noticed there tends to be an accumulation of most of them in Manhattan. So a lot of folks who I speak with in the Bronx often have to go to Manhattan, and can be an hour and a half commute one way in order to get an appointment with somebody. There are some really great organizations here in the Bronx, really awesome people who are running them, these scrappy grassroots organizations that don't necessarily have a huge annual operating budget, so the work that they're able to do is often limited because of situations like that. So I would promote this to anybody. I would say the Bronx Immigration Partnership is a really great group. So it's a grassroots collaboration of, I'd say, about a dozen to 15 people who basically are, strike that, I'm going to say 12 to 15 organizations, not people, of groups that are working together in different demographics and communities here in the Bronx. So essentially you have groups that I'm working with directly right now, like South Bronx United, which is a great organization that is running soccer clubs for young kids in the Bronx and simultaneously addressing personal immigration issues that they're having. Garifuna Community Services, also operating in the South Bronx and working with that particular community to give immigration help. And yeah, so there's these amazing grassroots organizations that are in all different neighborhoods in the South Bronx. And I think in terms of the actual amount for operating budget, it's tough to say. I think it's tough to say. I don't have necessarily a super specific amount. But when I think of the resources it could take for any particular case, really, and there's so many different fees, right? Because a lot of these applications, for example, if people are affirmatively filing these applications, they can run hundreds of dollars, which the client is already responsible for filing, or I should say, getting that amount of money to attach to the application. And then you think about, being able to either hire or contract out lawyers or accredited representatives so it, depending on how many people, what the need is, and what people need to do, it could be quite a bit. So you really need a pretty robust annual budget to be able to serve, I think, that level of people. And I think in the meantime, it's a lot of people really busting their butts on the ground to do whatever they can in the most efficient, effective way possible. So before I came to New York through this project that's had me traveling for a really long time, so before here, I was actually in Chicago working with the National Immigrant Justice Center. So I was there and I knew I wanted to go to New York City. It was the next spot on my list. And I know New York City has a great reputation for being really pro-immigrant. I knew there were a ton of resources here, so I just wanted to learn as much as possible, frankly, from being here. So I had my eye on two boroughs, either the Bronx or Queens. And I know a number of people who live in New York City, but at that time, I didn't have a solid, for sure connection. I was like, okay, this is where I'm going to be based at this time. I was open, looking for leads. And this is where my friend came in, and she was just like, hey, I know this group of sisters who are in the Bronx, and I think they'd be really into what you're doing. And they can potentially host you and just help plug you in with a community ASAP. So that's initially how it started, frankly, was through this really lucky connection with a friend. And then I think, as I had said before, I think the first day once I got here, I was like, this is a good fit. This is a really good fit, because it reminded me so much of the places where I had grown up. And I think there's these certain places where once you land, you feel at ease, you feel at home, and there's not a lot of work in terms of being able to just feel comfortable there. And then I think there's other places where that's not the case. And the Bronx was something from the very beginning. It felt very comfortable. So where I was before, so Mott Haven, Port Morris, I like that area. I also really like the Belmont area, Arthur Ave. There are a lot of tasty eats on Arthur Ave, so I do frequent there whenever I can. The parks, I love how the Bronx has the most parks out of any borough. So honestly, I try to get to one of those whenever I can. So Pelham Bay, I just go for these almost like Forrest Gump type of long walks where I just go and like process things and walk around. So I go there, the Botanical Garden, Wave Hill. There's so many great places. But yeah, I think it mostly revolves around those walking areas and the eats, admittedly. So when I think of those three cities, when I think of where my father's from, Cleveland, when I think of where I grew up, Lowell, when I think of the Bronx, I think the similarity that all three of those cities share is that they are frequently underestimated and misunderstood. So I just have these memories growing up, and even recently when I'm with my dad and he'll be talking to somebody and it comes up in conversation where it's like, oh, where are you from? And he'll be like, oh, I'm from Cleveland. And without skipping a beat, they'll just be like, oh, I'm sorry you're from there, or just like, oh, like the mistake on the lake, and just like immediately getting into that reputation for what Cleveland is. And I think growing up in Lowell, I had a lot of that I still encounter today wherever I go in my travels and work, where Lowell, similar to Cleveland and similar to the Bronx, like working class cities, a lot of immigrants, a lot of communities of color. And in Lowell, where it was really the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and then by the time those textile mills had faded away, you were into the 70s and the 80s where a lot of those buildings were abandoned and there wasn't any industry or any people living in those buildings. And it's one of those things where there are these ideas of what people think of these cities that, again, are working class, lots of immigrants, communities of color, and then what comes up for people during that. And then you have people who are in these communities who are creating beautiful things, doing beautiful things, living in these awesome communities. And I think I have a passion for being there where that is and living in a place like that where there is a realness and working hard. And to me, those are the types of places I want to be. I think when you are from somewhere like Cleveland or Lowell or the Bronx and you just hear these comments all the time said to you to your face, a lot of times by strangers or people who know you fairly well, where it's basically just like a straight up insult or comment about where you're from. And I find that to be super rude and offensive. And to see, to go through that frequently in the city I grew up outside of Boston, and then watching my dad, and then talking to friends in the Bronx about similar situations. Yeah, it's hard not to be constantly on the receiving end of those comments that are unsolicited and offensive and rude. So when I was growing up in Lowell, I went to private school, from Catholic school actually, from kindergarten until I was a senior in high school. So Lowell, I think like a lot of other American cities, and I would say this to this day, where there is a lot of diversity, but there's a lot of segregation as well. In certain neighborhoods, certain institutions, things like that. So I had made the decision to go to law school part-time because I went back to law school a little later. So I had worked as a community organizer for probably about 5 or so years, and then I decided to go back to school. So I had a number of friends who had already gone to law school full-time, and I also want to say I get, sometimes that's the decision people need to make, which I totally respect. For me, personally, after seeing some folks go through it full time where they took out a bunch of loans, like a bunch of private loans, and because they understandably, needed to take out an amount of money for the loans, then I think that influenced a lot of the choices career-wise that they had to make afterwards. So I saw a number of friends go through that, and a lot of them were really straight up with me, where they were just like, I am not happy doing this. I'm really miserable. And I saw a number of people go through that cycle. And once I had realized I wanted to be a lawyer to really supplement my work as a community organizer, I was like, okay, I need to figure out, like, how do I do this in a different way? So I started researching part-time programs with the thought that I would work full-time in order to not take out any private loans. So it was a 4-year program. It was pretty intense. I mean, I think every single moment of every day mostly was planned out. So it was work most of the day, go to these night classes, anywhere from the first year, I can't even believe it, looking back on it, was 4 nights a week. So it was full-time job, then go to class until like 8:30, 9 o'clock, go home. And that was my life for about 4 years. So it was challenging, but for me personally, looking back on that and having the flexibility and freedom to design my legal career right now as I feel free to do without being tied to this feeling of needing to pay back private loans was huge for me. So I have no regrets doing that, but it was at the time very hard. Yeah. I will say I have had a couple of friends who have done exactly that, where they've gone to law school full time, and then they go and they're an associate at a big firm, and then they're working God knows how many hours per week, like 80, 100-hour weeks. In that particular case, I feel like there's some people who actually dig it, they like it, which to each their own, but I think the vast majority of people who I speak to who go down that route, it's just crushing them because it really renders no other time for anything to take place. So I think when I have friends or folks who reach out to me and they're just asking me about law school in general, I think the rule of thumb is just, what do you want your life, really generally speaking, to look like after this? Like if a person's cool with, putting in the time, but they really want to go full time, get it done in 3 years, but they know that potentially lays ahead, but that doesn't weigh on them as much for whatever reason, then go for it. But I really emphasize the part-time program as a way to frankly get some other balance and perspective too, because even though it was a lot of work, in my work as an organizer, it was like, okay, these are like real issues with real people that are going on that make a lot of the hypothetical, the theoretical in law school seem super concrete. And I think that perspective is invaluable. Yeah, I think with the preface that everyone's so different. Like I recently had a friend who, actually I have a couple friends who were part-time and then they went full-time because they personally were like, I actually need to accelerate this process personally for myself no matter what. And it's like, okay, I get that. I think I agree in terms of the financial aspect where, yeah, debt is real, finances are super real. I think for anyone who's looking to go through a graduate program like that, that's definitely one of the things to analyze first and foremost. So when I started the part-time program, I'd been a community organizer for a long time, and I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer to add that set of strategies and tactics to my wheelhouse as being an advocate in general. And I knew that my career being in the public interest sector is not a sector that yields typically super high pay. So for me, it was a really pivotal moment of just, okay, I need to figure out personally, that's a big priority for me. How do I go through this schooling in ideally the least amount of money possible? And just the way where I'm not going to feel like I'm chained to this decision of a job that I don't even want to be in after law school. How do they make that happen? And I did not decide to primarily focus in immigration and asylum, frankly, until I started this project. And I think a lot of school is like that too, where school is awesome. Like I really loved being in school in general. I think that there are certain programs in schools that are really interactive, which is needed. Clinics, I think, ways to get out there and just ensure that what you're doing is actually the proper fit once you're outside of the classroom and not talking about just theory. So I think it's more of I don't think you need to know everything, like what type of law you want to go into, exactly where you want to practice, all that. But I think there does need to be a general big picture why law school, why now, and what generally do you want your life to look like after law school, so that you're just not stuck, hopefully, in doing something that you hate but you have to do in order to pay back loans and debt. So something that comes up for me as you're talking that I also want to address and throw in there is that, yeah, I think there's like a lot of external pressure, and I've also noticed it where even in like, the next generation that's not that much younger than me and vice versa, yeah, it's like this really intense pressure of like, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna be? And I feel like that is just like a larger existential question that is just repeatedly going to be answered throughout the course of someone's life. And I think it's just super wild to be putting so much pressure on our youth to be, just what are you going to do? with your life. So I think the way, as you were asking that question, that comes up for me, the thing that's most important for me is, I think for a person to just really hone in on their values. Because I think when a person is true to oneself and really hones in on that set of values, I think the vocation, whatever that's going to be, is a vehicle for whatever that set of values is. And that vehicle can change. You know, a person can be an organizer, a person can be an educator, a lawyer. That all fits under this general umbrella of social justice and change, working for that. So I think that, you know, when I think of just our youth and preparing our youth for different careers, what they're going to do, you know, after they're out of school, I would really like to see a lot of that emphasis be put on cultivating that set of values in relationship with oneself, so that there's the confidence, I think, to be able to go out there and try a bunch of different things, and through that experience really get a sense of what somebody wants to do. And I think the more mentors and the more folks that can kind of take people on and just, hey, this is what this career actually looks like, and just give some more food for thought for people as they're doing their own processing. Because I think that I certainly felt a lot of that pressure growing up, and, you know, well into adulthood too, of just, you know, what's it going to be? Like, what are you going to focus on? And what's that root of conventionality that, you know, you're gonna do? So I think being able to just have a sense of really knowing oneself is what's paramount in those situations. Yeah, you know, and I've been actually thinking of a way to somehow get back in the classroom in a general sense, because that was my first job after college, was teaching junior high for a couple years. So it was something that made a huge impact in me, and it's something that I really miss in general. There was a high level of honesty of those interactions between teachers and students in the classroom, and it's something that I really miss. So yeah, I would love to get back in there. When I think about this topic and this conversation, it is a huge systemic set of issues, right? Like I feel like you have a lot of different issues with exactly like redlining, zoning. You have just how districts are being carved congressionally and otherwise, and funding and money, and there's just so many different intersections of how I think those issues are playing out, to where, yeah, it's just like a colossal set of systems, and how those systems interact and often create strife. So I have been thinking about this concept for a while, where sometimes in certain circles, you know, you run into somebody, it's like, oh, small world, like, you know, so-and-so, et cetera. And the way I actually visualize that is that when I think of American society, or really arguably any society, it's like a series of concentric circles. So depending on what circle you might be in society, you know, you're going to know other people who are in that similar realm of life. So for example, a lot of, as you were talking about that video where they are more affluent white folks living in Manhattan, like that is one particular social circle where it wouldn't be surprising that a lot of them know each other, you know, sending their kids to the same school, saying hi, you know, in the hallways, things like that. And in my experience living in all these different communities across the US, it's not super common that you have a certain concentric circle interacting with other circles of people. And I think that's a huge part of the problem, because when there's not a direct intersection of trying to talk to those people in those other concentric circles, it's all theoretical. It's all hypothetical of just what this policy might do, without really having a conversation with somebody and hearing from that person what is up on that particular issue. And I think that would be a great first step to begin, is to really intentionally make an effort to get out of that circle of being, of existence, the people you know, and make a deliberate effort to know some folks who are not in that same world as you. So I think the nature of practicing in law, yeah, it's an adversarial system. You have the prosecution, you have the defense. So in its inherent nature, you're going to have this tension, this argumentative tension, and that is present, I think, all the time. And I think there are individual actors within the system who really, you know, they might particularly lean hard into that adversary system. And yeah, I've encountered, when I go ahead and litigate cases in immigration court, there's the immigration judge and then there's the ICE attorney. And there have been some ICE attorneys who, completely unprovoked by myself, they're really super aggressive. They're really hostile and super aggressive, and that is a big part of the environment. And that hostility comes a lot from the judges as well. So you have this kind of systemic hostility and aggression that I think is always present because of the nature of what the law is. And then there is this other side of it where, especially in immigration, a lot of other fields of law too, where it is like paperwork heavy. So there are just these images in my head of me sitting at a desk with maybe, 1,000 papers, and I'm just reading each of those papers, and it's really intense work in a different way, where I'm sitting down and reading somebody's case, which is really critical and important, but also, I'm sitting by myself reading that file. So I think there's like this really intense spectrum of, I think there is the drama, if you will, because of the nature of it. And then I think there is a lot of isolation and working and sitting down and writing somebody's brief as well. So, oh my gosh, yeah. I think it really depends on the type of case. Like, I think, speaking from immigration, I think in asylum case, it would be pretty hard to really put an exact number. It really depends on each case, but it can be a lot. Like, as a personal limit, in order to do a lot of work but also not completely burn myself out, I have this self-imposed rule where I try not to do more than 2 individual hearings or 2 trials a month for asylum, because each of those cases in and of itself is going to require, again, it really depends on the case, but it could be 30, 40, 50 hours for like one case in order to prepare all the evidence and practice the testimony with the client. So in order to do a really good job as a lawyer, ideally you want to have the time to prepare for that. I would like to make an attorney movie where all the attorneys essentially come together and just destroy the status quo. And I really haven't seen a movie that fits into that exact genre. So I feel like every person is born with potential and a gift for whatever it could be. It's super versatile. Someone can be an educator, someone can be a filmmaker, somebody can be a lawyer. And again, as I was saying earlier, it's like a vehicle, I think, for what set of values and passions a person wants to articulate into the world and amplify. So I really feel it's giving folks the resources to be able to, and we've touched upon this, I know, in other parts of our conversation too, but give people the resources to just own that about themselves, like really knowing that about themselves, and then being able to thus like plug it into different modalities like out in the community. But I think the thing that is just so complex about, I think, these set of issues is that, when I think of like systemic failure, dysfunction, I almost have this image in my head of all these different lines, literally just all these different lines kind of intersecting with each other. And that's really the way that I see a lot of these issues. I think as an educator in South Los Angeles, it was the education system, but it was also the housing system. It was also the de facto segregation. It was also, I could go on about like all these different systems that collectively make that impact. So I think in order to really put a dent in it, we need people in all those different field. I think it's really about what somebody personally feels passionate about, and then what we can do as a community to support those efforts. I've given this quite a bit of thought, where I think having different classes of what's out there in the real world. So certainly the legal system impacts us daily. It certainly impacts certain communities more disparately than others. I think that there should be a base education on that in general. Same thing with financial management too, where a lot of the things that aren't being taught readily in schools are issues that continue to come up in really any person's life. And of course, you got to wonder in terms of systemically, why these classes aren't being more readily taught, and what the potential of what could happen if folks had that empowerment with that knowledge, definitely. So a lot of the organizing jobs that I had before, so I had worked just out on the ground as a community organizer, and then I had worked for a couple organizations where they had online memberships of people from across the country. So the online organizing was primarily organizing that group of people online using technology initially to kind of get people together. So it would eventually, the goal would be to start from an online space where there were people from all over the place, and then the real goal was to really funnel them into an offline project where they were out there similarly on the ground doing what they needed to do to organize. I love working with people one-on-one. I think that out of all the different options or modalities, that is what I would generally prefer. And I think as an attorney too, I think that there is this mystification of the law that has been there for a long time. You know, you read a statute or you read any type of legal language, and super understandably, it's just like, what is this? So I think there is already this imbalance of, like, what is that, you know, what are these documents? What does this whole process even mean? And in those one-on-one relationships, like, one of the things that I really try to strive for is just lateralism, where I want this relationship to feel professional. And I also want it to feel that, like, we are working together as a team. We're really on the same playing field. You know, I want to be as approachable as possible. So when I think of that one-on-one relationship, I want to create that space, that trust, that container where a lot of these cases, a lot of people have quite a bit that's on the line. And I think for them to put so much trust in me as an advocate requires me to at least meet them halfway. So that is super important to me. Yeah, it's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, because some of the jobs I've had in the past, to be straight up, were macro level, but they were so far removed from what was going on the ground that I just remember I was at this job and I was in a meeting and we were talking about something. And it was like the meta layers of talking about something that's talking about something. And you're kind of at a point where you're like, what are we doing sitting in this room? Like, what are we actually doing on the ground? And it was a really big moment for me where I just was questioning, like, what am I doing, like, in this field? How do I get back out there to why I even started doing this in the first place? I think the ideal thing for me is that if I'm able to work on a one-on-one situation, and then, like, I've written a handful of op-eds about some of those individual clients, you know, in a confidential manner, but, like, what happened during that person's case or during that person's trajectory that actually is informative of a larger societal systemic issue that is worthy of critical discussion. So I'm, like, basically taking the real, what's happening on the ground, like these stories that need to be amplified, sharing that within a larger audience of writing an op-ed or, you know, writing something, doing something for, like, a larger audience. And then I think more people learning about things that maybe wasn't on their radar before. And to me, that is the seed of more macro level change. So I think being a lawyer, I think, you know, there's all these different vocations and different things, right? I think those are all tactics on the general strategy of, like, what we need to do as a social justice movement to dismantle the status quo. So one of the toughest things, and I'll be straight up with you about being a lawyer, is that, you know, when I'm representing somebody, and there's countless stuff in mainstream media about how these immigration proceedings are going down, it is off the wall sometimes. It's really, and a lot of it is because the immigration courts are not using a lot of the rules per se that other courts are. So for example, in immigration court, there's no federal rules of evidence, which in a criminal court, you know, they're very specific. So it's a little ad hoc. It's like a little mixture of kind of this and that, and a lot of these proceedings can be off the wall.
So isn't a proceeding also, especially with immigration, can it last like under 5 minutes or something?
If a person especially is not represented, I have sat in the gallery while somebody who's pro se or self-represented has gone up, and I've seen those proceedings go rapidly, and, you know, you're just sitting there thinking, and you're like, this isn't due process. You know, this person is essentially, like, you almost have this image of somebody, it's like a processing station where somebody is, you know, sitting there, their name gets called. If they don't have a lawyer, they go up. And yeah, I have seen those proceedings wrap up in like 5-10 minutes. And, you know, it's something that's supposed to be like a full scale hearing, and it's unbelievable. And it's obviously somebody's life. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Like, I think if more people knew and were able to witness how some of these proceedings go, I think they would be floored. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is like the big question is like, how do we dismantle the status quo that's like keeping these systems so oppressively in place? And I think that what's hard is that, yeah, I think as an advocate, it's like I'm very aware that I'm working within, frankly, a dysfunctional system to try to obtain justice for a particular person. So it is this compartmentalization, this duality of like, okay, yes, I am here, I am litigating this case, and I am observing real time some of the dysfunction and frankly abuses sometimes that happens during a person's trial. And I think that's why I'm really grateful I have my organizing side, because I oftentimes try to lean on that to come up with more proactive solutions on how to challenge some of these agents that have a lot of power. So I almost think of it as like an infinity loop of I am working within the system to a certain extent, but for me personally, I need to rely on more creative, proactive strategies too. So I think being a lawyer, it's something that I am, but I wouldn't say it's the totality of my identity, nor would I put the weight of what I want to contribute in social justice solely on just being a lawyer. Oh, so many why nots. There's certain things I think for people when it's almost, I'm not trying to make this like a, analogy that doesn't have its equivalence in weight, but it's like a food, right? Where you're like, oh, I don't like that food, or like, I just don't like it. And I feel like with big law, I don't know, it was just something, corporate law firm, there's never been a moment for me in my entire life where I was like, yeah, maybe I could do that for a little bit. Like, it was just something that and again, I think supplemented by seeing friends go through the process, and I think they were just so overtly miserable that the misery of it, I think, as we're talking about like the big why, like who or what is being represented, I think in some of those cases, like what's the end game there? Is the end game, winning a settlement for a big corporation that already has a lot of money? What's the why? And I think that for me, the why was something that it just didn't feel right. It didn't make sense for me with big law. So I started Attorney on the Move right after I had graduated from law school. So I graduated from law school. I took the Massachusetts bar where I'm still licensed. And then it must have been 2 weeks later, I went to Boston for the swearing-in ceremony, and then I was living in Oakland at the time, and I packed up, and actually still to this day, all the stuff that I have fits in that little smart car. So I gave away all my stuff. I packed all the stuff in the smart car, and then it was just an idea where I was like, I'm going to start this out for 6 months and see how it goes, because I've been really fortunate to live in a lot of different communities in the US, but there were so many that I just, when we were talking about that idea of concentric circles, and there were certain circles where I was like, I don't, as diverse as I feel like my network of friends is, like there's still communities in the US where like, I don't know anybody. I don't know what it's like there. I want to see what it's like to be able to be a better advocate. I think to be able to see what else is in this country that's super diverse, but someone who grew up in suburban Boston and even going to school out of state and living on the West Coast for a little bit, those are still like very select experiences when you have an infinite number of experiences in the US.
Would you visit all 50 states?
Altogether there were 13 places where I spent anywhere from, I would say, about a couple months in each spot. And I did, either through this project or luckily in travels before, make it to, there's only, I'm trying to think, I think 3 states in the US I haven't been to. I haven't been to Nebraska, North Dakota, and Alaska. I think it really depends on the type of work that I'm actually doing. So for example, when I am taking on an asylum case for an individual hearing or a trial, or if I'm doing an appeal, those individual cases can take quite a bit of time. So I don't have like a hard and set limit that I put on myself, like a monthly metric, but I usually try to do no more than several, I would say, in any given month. Because I think more than that, and you're just going to be, and I don't have a paralegal, I don't have any support staff. Like I'm like numbering the pages myself, after I write or submit everything. So I have to factor in for that extra time too. Yeah, so the first step of the asylum process is what's called the credible fear interview. And it basically determines whether or not a person has a credible fear that enables them to pursue the rest of their asylum claim in court. So on those particular days, I would meet with, it would really depend, maybe a dozen women a day, and just, go over, like, this is what the interview is going to be like, tell me a little bit about what happened to you, why are you seeking asylum here in the United States. So it really depends on the exact project that I'm working on. But yeah, depending on the scope of the work, it could be anywhere from that scenario to, I think for the longer individual hearings and trials, it can take quite a bit of time. Sure. So there's really two main things I think of, because I get asked that question a lot, like why immigration law? So I'm a second generation immigrant. My mother immigrated from Thailand when she was in her late 20s. And I had essentially a front row seat for what that experience was like for her. And in terms of everything, in terms of growing up in this community, which we have discussed a little bit in the past, her experiences being an immigrant in this country and things that she had to go through as a result of that. So I feel like I know that experience really well from growing up, witnessing my mother. And then when I think immigration too, I think about all the clients I've worked with, all these asylum clients, and really all from all over the world and really different walks of life. And when I think of immigration justice, I really think of that as the main umbrella for a lot of these other social justice issues, such as, I've had LGBTQ clients, I've had clients who were persecuted because they're women, clients because of their political opinion. So all of these different identities and how there has been persecution because of those identities, and that all fits under the immigration umbrella. So I felt like it was the single way that I could try to make, as an individual, an impact on multiple systemic issues, because it all falls under the immigration justice umbrella for sure. As being like real, it's like very scrappy, but it's been cool because and I've written about this on my blog too, where over the last, really especially the first year and a half, but especially the totality of this journey, 4 years. Yeah, I've had a lot of encounters with a lot of kind and generous people throughout this journey. So all of my work that's pro bono, it's been crowdfunded the entire 4 years. So it's 100% crowdfunded. The amount of the donations, it really depends on the person, but I think the average donation, I should really crunch those numbers sometimes, but like it's like a single contribution, maybe like $25 or something like that. But when you have a number of people who share in your vision, they also believe in that vision of this needs to get done. I think in my experience, it's been really uplifting to feel like people want to be able to support that in some way. And I think when you get that critical mass of people who want to support it, it's something that can become a reality. And then, yeah, I've done a lot of, as we were talking about before in the Bronx, like I've lived with nuns. I've done, I've camped before. I have done couch surfing. And some of those people I met, we're still in touch. We're still really close friends. I would not have actually met those people if I had, gone in a hotel somewhere. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think a lot of the people who I've been really fortunate to meet were a result of doing the project in this way. So because, like we were talking about before, I knew I didn't want to do the big firm. And because I had gone to school part-time as well, a lot of my peers were in the full-time program over the summer. They would have these like internships where they would go clerk at places. But I was working full-time as an organizer. Like I couldn't, because a lot of those clerkships were full-time. And after the summer, then, you had to go back to school, and I just couldn't handle that disruption with the organizing work at that time. So after I graduated, I was like, you know what? I want to just do a super immersive experience in this way, that I want to see what else is out there, see what other types of law are out there, see what other communities are like, what the legal needs are like out there. And The idea probably that last semester of law school, and I graduated and I was studying for the bar. It was like this idea crockpot, if you will, where I was like, the ideas were kind of marinating in there. And then I think by the time I had taken the bar and I had like a little bit of time between the bar results and then getting sworn in, and I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this for 6 months. And if after 6 months it's just a wash, it doesn't work, I don't like it, then I'll move on and do something else. But yeah, it's been almost 4 years now. So I think some of the challenging aspects, like I said before, because it's pro bono and because I'm crowdfunding and grassroots fundraising, I don't have a paralegal, I don't have any support staff. On one hand, I really dig the fact that I actually can prepare. Like I know how to prepare everything, which I think most lawyers should know how to do. And I know that I put my stamp on every single one of those papers that's being submitted. So I have seen everything. I know what's going into the record. So it's kind of like a challenge, but also good that I know what's going into that. And yeah, I mean, I think, doing it in such a scrappy way and not having that certainty of just, okay, how is this next fundraising cycle going to go? Like how's the next 6 months, 1 year going to look like sustainably for the work and the project? Conversely, I think one of the biggest things that is a huge advantage of doing this work is that I feel like a free agent. Like I've written some op-eds before where I have directly called for the abolishment of ICE, which is actually not that radical of an idea, truly. But I think, and I'm not pointing the giant foam finger at some of these organizations, but they are working constantly with governmental agencies like ICE, and they need to keep that working relationship intact. So from somebody to go from an organization and on the record, to a major publication, be like, we should abolish ICE, that could potentially get back as getting back to somebody and really being able to hurt them in some way with their relationship with being on the ground. And I think being a free agent, I don't have to worry about that organizational repercussion, which is pretty great. I remember, I think it ties into the support staff thing. I remember this one case that I had, it was an asylum case, and I had almost 700 pages of supporting evidence for the case. And a lot of these organizations that have more money, they have these like automatic page, like it'll just, this machine and program that'll number it. So I was like numbering that by hand. And I think I was like around page 350 and I'd realized I had skipped one of the pages. Even thinking about it now, I'm just like, I had to go back and just like white out every single page that I had to correct. And it was in those moments where I question, like, this is rough. This is like me, like really bootstrapping this operation and like down to the page number. But time and time again, like I would rather hands down do that versus give up any of this autonomy like I was talking about before. I don't even have like a summative word when I think of just the last 3 years, but I had started this project in the summer of 2015. So it was during the Obama administration, and as many of us know, the Obama administration also had a lot of problems when it came to immigration policy, no doubt. So that was already setting that trajectory or path. But I remember when, he was coming out with all those preposterous statements, as he continues to do. I think it was the summer of 2015, because I think it was right before they were doing those primary debates. And I think he was just coming out with all of these ridiculous, sensationalist comments. And it's really, even talking about it now, just a trip to think about, because I think about that summer and how a lot of people, the people who I was interacting with predominantly at that time, were just like, this is, crazy. Like, there's no way this guy is going to be able to like get any traction. And then already at that point, I had been living in more rural, more conservative parts of the U.S. And I had started to see that, no, there's actually like a huge group of people who really condone and support these ideas. So I think because I had started the project right, it was like identical to when the presidential primary and campaign was launching, because I had launched that summer of 2015, and then it ended December 2016. So from start to finish, I was able to just see how people were reacting, not only to immigration, but also, the idea of a Trump presidency. And the whole time I felt like this guy really has a shot, because I was seeing in these different communities just how much support for different policies that he's putting out there he really has. Yes. So the second half of this project, before I moved back to the Bronx, I was living on the US-Mexican border for 2 years. So I was in Tucson for a year and a half. And then once the administration announced the zero tolerance family separation policy, I moved to El Paso for about 4 months. And then from there, I left the border and I came here to the Bronx. In a lot of ways, I think different parts of the US is dealing with immigration in like really similar ways and really different ways. No doubt on the southern border, it's more intense in a lot of ways. For example, these border patrol checkpoints are everywhere. So if you're driving on a freeway, and it's super common just to see a border patrol checkpoint set up where every single car that's going by has to unroll their window, and the agent will ask you, are you or the passengers in the car all US citizens? And if you aren't, then I've seen this happen from clients telling me stories, then people either behind or in back of me in line, then you have to show all the documents and prove exactly what your status is in that moment. The intensity of just the policies that are going down on the southern border, I think with family separation, that was of stating the obvious, but of course the most traumatic thing for the families who are going through that themselves, and also for the advocates who are down there to really witness and bear witness to that trauma and absorb that secondhand. But yeah, no doubt on the border there are a lot of advocates who are throwing down right now, and the issues are, I would say, even more heightened down there because of all the different policies that are going down there. I think protesting is important. I think protesting is a vehicle for collective voice, especially collective voice that is in resistance to, it could be whatever, oppressive status quo policy or law or person or issue is going on at the moment. And I think once that collective voice dissipates or is not being heard, we're in real trouble, because we're not speaking out collectively against people or issues or institutions that are oppressing so many people in this country. I think that it is a tactic. I think that we need to incorporate protesting more in a bigger strategy of how are we actually pushing the needle on some of these actors to either do certain things or not do certain things. So I think it is a tactic in the wheelhouse of a bigger strategy of how we collectively build more people power. I can think of times where I knew about it ahead of time and it was very coordinated, and then I just remember there was this other protest in Chicago, and again, the intersectionality of all these different issues and how truly intersectional and important they are. Where it was a Black Lives Matter protest in Chicago that was, probably summer 2016, and I remember I was walking in downtown Chicago. I think I had just met up with some friends, and then I had just seen, it was just a huge group of people, probably 1,000 people, and I had just joined in on that. So if there's ever an organic moment and then I'm there and I am feeling whatever protest is going down, there's a very high likelihood that I'll join in. A protest in terms of when we're talking about everything that we've been talking about today and the relevance. So this was August 2017, and I remember it was summer because I was living in Arizona and it was hot as hell. It was probably 115 degrees. And Trump had come to Phoenix and he was going to make a big speech at the Phoenix Convention Center. And the rumor mill was starting to build up that he was going to pardon Joe Arpaio during this particular convention speech. So I was living in Tucson at the time for a year and a half when I was down on the border, and I had heard that he was going to be in Phoenix, and then there immediately within the community were talks about how do we get people out there. Tucson's about an hour and a half away from Phoenix. So I had signed up to go in this van with a bunch of other people. And I didn't know any of these people. There were probably 12 of us that were in this van, but all that we had in common was that we were going to get out there and then we're going to go protest. So we had gotten into the van. We all bonded during that hour-and-a-half trip out there, and it was unreal. I've been to a good number of protests of different things in my life, but this was something that I really hadn't seen before, because all of the Trump supporters were going in to the convention center and they were being barricaded by the Phoenix Police Department. So it's basically, if you can imagine it, like people walking into the convention center, Trump supporters, a barricade, a lot of cops in straight up riot gear just barricading, and then the group of protesters, which I was in, that were waving all sorts of things, American flags. There were, those anti-45 that looks like a swastika. Seeing that juxtaposition of that image, especially in that crowd under those circumstances, really hit me in terms of what is this moment that we're in and what exactly that we're doing. And it was intense. There was a lot of shouting. The protesting crowd were, as usual, chanting things, and then the Trump supporters who were going in were taunting right back. It was intense. No doubt the essence of those causes I am down with. It's more of a licensing issue, actually. So I'm licensed in Massachusetts, so with immigration, it's federal, so I can practice wherever. And I need to admittedly brush up on my reciprocity laws, but certain states have reciprocity with each other. And I think New York and Massachusetts, like the relationship between those states in particular, I think if you're an attorney for 5 years in Mass, you can apply to waive into the New York jurisdiction, and I'm coming up around that time. So that might be something that I can waive into. But yeah, as of right now, I unfortunately am not barred in New York. So being able to participate legal counsel wise is something I couldn't do. But being a collaborator in other ways, yeah. And I think I could even break that down even further, where like some of the things that we touched upon, where, okay, it's like if you're working for a firm or like a legal organization, kind of depends on like the culture of that firm, right? Because it's like if the norm is like, most associates here put in 80 to 100 hour work week, it's like just of the essence of time, it's like that doesn't render a lot of extra time. And I know a lot of other friends who are solo practitioners too, and it's like another thing where, you can kind of set your own hours, but I feel like I found myself working more than I actually do in more traditional jobs, because like there's always something that needs to get done. There's always something to work on. So I think it's something that just requires a lot of boundaries, frankly, and just self-awareness and boundaries, and just being like, like some of the issues that we've been talking about today, they're just like so hugely systemic, and like I do feel that collectively, especially together, like we're chipping away at it. And I think because these issues are so long term, like I think generations to come are going to be working on these issues. It's like I think that balance is key, and I'm still trying to figure out for myself how to strike that balance. So I'm aware of it. I think it is putting it into action. It can get hard because it's really easy to get sucked into what you're working on. 3 different things. So I think the first thing is you're doing the best you can, and that's good enough. I think the second thing is be here, be now. And I think the third, it's really just like another iteration. The first thing is just, outside of being able to do your best, that is the most any one person can do. Thank you for watching Bronx Vignettes.